One of the things I've discovered over the years is that many Catholics who come to church faithfully every Sunday actually find it really hard to believe. Now, they would never admit that out loud. It's only when they're chatting to a priest privately that you get a little glimpse of the reality. But a lot of people come here hoping to encounter God, but regularly feeling like they're just not seeing what they're looking for. And week after week, you keep coming here, and yet it kind of feels like this idea that we're speaking about, this idea that we believe in intellectually, just seems so far beyond our grasp. So if that's you, you're not alone. Okay? Actually, a lot of Catholics are like that. But I think that is the experience that the readings today is particularly speaking into. You see, when John the Baptist appears, he's fulfilling this really important role where Jesus is about to come. But God realizes that if Jesus just turns up, no one's actually going to realize who he is. Even though every human heart is yearning for God, there are things blocking us from actually seeing the presence of God. And so John's job is to prepare the way. And as he says, that every mountain and hill will be laid low, every valley will be filled in. The winding ways will be straightened, the rough roads made smooth. Now, this is actually really important to understand, because what he's saying here is that there are things in the way between you and the presence of God. Not necessarily physical mountains, but there are things which are blocking your sight. As I said, like your soul has been made to see God. That's the very reason you exist. And so if you can't see God, there is something blocking your vision. And what John is trying to say is we've got to pull down those mountains. We've got to fill in those valleys. If you think of, you've got these blockages, but then you've got these valleys where sometimes you can see God, but you simply can't get there. Maybe there are times where you are trying to pray, but it just feels like you can't bridge that gap. Now, when you look at our society at the moment, I think we've got to recognize that we are becoming more and more distant from God, really because these barriers are getting bigger. If you look back the last 200 years, atheism really only became a thing around the early 1800s. It's a very recent phenomenon. Now, most people would say that atheism came about because we stopped believing in God and we started believing in science instead, because it happened around the same time as the scientific revolution. But that's a little bit too simplistic, because there's a few other things that were going on at the same time. Firstly, one of the key things that happened was the Industrial Revolution, which meant that people were no longer living in the country surrounded by God's creation. They were now moving into the cities surrounded by our own creation. Whereas originally we would look out the window and we would see the presence of God, now we were just seeing the work of our own hands, which was kind of made in our own image and likeness. Now, with that came an enormous upheaval of society where the whole family unit became changed overnight. You no longer had this big family or village and people loving and caring for each other, but you now had families migrating and moving away and separated. Fathers working far from home and coming back only very, briefly. And so the whole experience of love became fractured. And so when you actually look at a lot of the famous atheists, if you dig down and look at their family history, their families were really broken. And it makes a whole lot of sense that they don't believe in God because they'd never actually encountered love. Now, over the years, I've actually done a bit of a test with that, particularly when I'm talking to high school students. I always try and get a bit of a survey of the room about who does or doesn't believe in God. And then I'll always ask the second question of, who here doesn't believe in the existence of love? And 100% every time, the atheists in the room put their hands up, that they don't believe in the existence of love. And I think this is what kind of reveals the blockage. If your experience of human love has been broken or damaged in some way, it's going to be really hard for you to encounter divine love. You know, we say that God is love. You know, the very presence of God is revealed through love. Now, the other thing we say about God, we refer to the character of God as being truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, once again, these three things have become really corrupted and distorted in our world. You know, where beauty has been exchanged for efficiency and speed, and, you know, we've kind of lost any sense of truth. We're now very much in a post-truth world where everything is just relativism. And when you start to have all these things broken down, you know, even with trust being broken down, when you can't believe in goodness anymore, it actually becomes really impossible to believe in God. If the very people around you are creating that blockage, how can you ever see the face of God? So when John says, tear down the mountains, fill in the valleys, there's a couple of sides to this. I think firstly for ourselves, we need to recognize in our life what are the blockages. If it is something from your family history, if it is something about the way you're living, you know, where you're just so caught up in the functional side of the world that you feel more like a machine than a human, tear down that mountain. You know, do something dramatic to make a change. Now, tearing down a mountain sounds dramatic. I was reading recently about in China, where one of their cities was struggling because they didn't have enough flat ground, because there was a huge mountain range blocking the city's growth. And they literally pulled down the mountain range. In a couple of months, they just destroyed it and made it into flat ground. Do that in your own life. You know, whatever it is that is blocking you from the glory of God, do whatever you can to make that path straight. I was reading a quote during the week by St. Anselm, famous saint from about 1,000 years ago. And he simply said, I was made to see God. And so if I can't see him, I'm failing in the whole purpose of my existence. I think that's a big wake-up call. You know, this whole idea of encountering God and seeing the presence of God is not just a nice optional extra in our life. It's the very reason you breathe. And so if you can't see God, then do whatever you can to clear that path and make it possible. Two of the key things that John the Baptist refers to is repentance of sins. Your sin is the biggest thing that blinds you. Very often people say, you know, I'm not going to go to confession until I encounter God. But it's actually the other way around. You won't encounter God until you go to confession. I heard a great story years ago of a very prominent journalist in Australia, Mike Willesee, who had grown up Catholic and had been curious about miracles, all these sort of stories about faith, and gradually come to a point where intellectually, I think he believed, but he couldn't actually make that jump. And he was talking to a priest about this, about how he just finds it so hard to believe the way that the priest believes. And the priest simply said, I'm going to hear your confession right now. And he was like, what? I don't think I want you to hear my confession. He said, you've got no choice. I'm going to hear your confession. And he basically kind of forced him to go through this. But as soon as he confessed his sins, it was like the scales fell from his eyes. And he could now actually see the presence of God. And he turned his whole life around. And I think it just reveals how much that is the thing blocking us. The things that we're ashamed of, the things that we're burying deep in our hearts, remove them, and allow the light of Christ to come in. The other key thing that John talks about, he actually refers to this prophecy from the book of Malachi, where he says, I've come to reconcile the hearts of fathers to their sons and the hearts of sons to their fathers. Sometimes it's translated as fathers to their children or parents to their children. But once again, there's something really profound here. Very often the biggest blockage to seeing the presence of God is the fact that our relationship with our own parents is so broken. I've not experienced the love that I desired from them, and so I simply cannot trust the God that I can't see. And so there is something there about removing that mountain, going through a place of reconciliation or healing, and being able to say, God, I want to encounter you as my true Father, to know your love and your goodness. Now, I think there's another layer to this, which actually speaks very closely into your vocation. As I mentioned, there are two sides to the mission in the Gospels. Jesus is going to come and proclaim the kingdom of God, but John has to prepare the way for that to be heard. When you look within the church, everyone has a part to play in revealing the kingdom. Now, you might sit there and think, well, I can't preach. You know, my job doesn't allow me to stand up on my desk at the office and start telling people about Jesus. Now, that might be my job, but your job is to prepare the way. Your job is to create a culture of love, which allows people's hearts to be open to then hear the gospel. And so I think there is a side to this which is very personal, where we need to remove the mountains in our own life. But then there is something that speaks to your vocation, how you are meant to remove the mountains in other people's lives. To create a culture of love, a culture of beauty, a culture of goodness and truth. And so wherever you are, whether it's in your family, your neighborhood, your workplace, to be doing those things that makes the presence of God within reach for people. Now, once again, I've seen so many stories of this, of where a person who does not believe in God, maybe they've been brought up as an atheist, but they move into a workplace surrounded by Christians who aren't particularly preaching at them, but they're just loving them. And very quickly, this person starts wanting to go to church and get baptized. That innate desire for God, that natural yearning for the face of God suddenly finds its home when those mountains and barriers are removed. When they find themselves in a culture which makes love real and present, which respects their dignity and affirms their humanity, it makes it so much easier for that person to make the step of faith. Now, that is the lay vocation. That's your job in the world. So let's come into this time of Advent now really yearning to see the face of God, being prepared to make those hard choices of how to pull down the mountains in our life, but then also praying for that grace to go out on mission as lay people in the world to prepare the way for Christ, to create a world that makes God real and present to people.